I'm going to be presenting different models, philosophical models for thinking about what addiction is and how addiction intersects with responsibility, because I think it's something that maybe doesn't directly shape your research projects, although I want us to think together about the way that it does, but maybe intersects with the outcomes that you hope to get out of your research, right? Like kind of what you hope to happen from it, how you see it as contributing to a more just society or an ethical society. Um, Hopefully, especially since it's before lunch, the fact that it's gonna be more interactive will be welcome. Okay, so we're starting right off with responsibility. What do you guys think it is? The word we use a lot. What is responsibility? Anyone feel like they have a intuition they would like to share?
I think it's a feeling that you have about a situation,
Okay.
that you have some power or agency over something, and that if it doesn't get used, it creates tension.
Yeah, great, good. So it's this kind of a feeling of power or agency, something about like using that power in a situation. So yeah, you're identifying it with personal responsibility, right? Like it's something about the individual themselves.
Or professional responsibility, in that, like, as a physician, I have power and have been entrusted by our collective moray, our collective norms, our collective, to do the right thing.
Yeah, so maybe there are responsibility can connect to certain areas where you're seen as having maybe like a special power over like certain types of actions, right? So there might be increased responsibility that attaches to certain professional roles. Yeah, what else? Jai, there are no wrong answers. I'm not gonna like do the thing where you all say things and then I tell you what it really is.
I'm thinking of, this kind of bidirectionality of obligation, that responsibility just doesn't lie with the individual who is going to perhaps perform their professional duties, but that it's also has to be a moral obligation to those that we are responsible for.
Yeah, so this language of obligation, right? Obligation and duty is interesting because this connects with the idea of professional responsibility, right? Like there are kind of special obligations or special duties. There might also be like universal obligations and duties that we have just as being human beings. But yeah, that kind of gives us, these are things we ought to do, things we should do. It suggests we're responsible for them, maybe because we have agency or power over them in a special kind of way. Yeah, what else?
It's terrific that all of us use this word all the time and we don't know what it means.
Yeah. I actually once did this in an undergraduate class and I was like, what does it mean? So now, yeah.
It seems like responsibility is like the space between some sort of concept or emotion about what should be, and then the act of making a decision about your own behavior or position. And so responsibility is like the connection between what should be and then the decision you make.
Yeah, good. So how I'm understanding what you just said, right, is like what should be is sort of your, maybe like your intention or your motivation, right? Like there's this situation you're trying to create, like you're motivated to create it, and then because you're motivated, you're responsible for it. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, I think that the should can be defined in a lot of ways. And that should might be like a personally defined should. It might be a concept that's like larger than yourself, or it might be some sort of like mutually interpersonally created should. So I don't think it's necessarily just my like subjective should that I'm like pushing forward, but it's me trying to like reach into that thing beyond me and then bring it into existence.
Yeah. You may be aware of this, but you're essentially advocating a Kantian ethical perspective. So, right, so Kant thinks that anytime we act, we're trying to create a kingdom of ends, which is basically like a situation, an ideal situation in which we're all equal. We all kind of do the right thing towards each other. And so whenever we do something, we're trying to like make that happen. And yeah, the should is the normative should, right? So like if something is normative, it means you should do it. Kant will say you should do it because it helps you create this kingdom of ends. I'm not gonna get too Kantian, I promise. Yeah.
I wonder about the difference between a responsibility and being responsible. Because you can have a responsibility, but if you don't meet that responsibility, you are not being responsible. So one is like a trait and one is a thing you have to do.
Yeah.
But some people take responsibility for things that they really have no responsibility for.
Yeah.
They're probably very anxious.
Yeah.
And then other people have been given responsibility and they don't live up to it.
Yeah, good. So they're kind of like those things we have like special obligations over or something like that. Those might be the things we're responsible for because of our role. And then there's this like character trait, right? Of like being responsible, being irresponsible, right? Which is going to play into kind of stigma and things like this. But yeah, some people, many of the millennials are very anxious, and so we're like feel like we need to be responsible for everything. And then yeah, it can be character trait as something moral can be perverted when people feel like they're kind of overexerting themselves. Yeah, Michaela.
I'm just wondering, like, if responsibility would even exist if we didn't have expectations. Like, are we only responsible because we're expected to be, or expected to carry out certain functions?
Yeah,
If there wasn't the expectations, would we even need to be responsible?
yeah,
Or have any responsibilities, like what you were saying?
yeah. Say more about expectations. So like, where are you thinking these expectations come from, or maybe even say more about like what would a world without expectations look like?
So I'll use like a personal example.
Yeah.
My mom expects me to call her every day. I kind of feel well if I don't.
Yeah.
If she didn't expect me to call every day, I probably wouldn't.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is interesting. I mean, so I feel like part of what this is pointing out is this idea that like people can, so this is the opposite of Sam, what you just said, like people might feel more responsible for certain things they're not supposed to, they don't actually have responsibility for. It's not part of their obligations. Other people can also make us feel responsible for things that we actually are not, like we don't have to be responsible for. They're not part of like our shoulds, right? Like our normative things we need to do. And so, yeah, that's a way interpersonally people might put that on us, right? Not to say like, it's not the case that you shouldn't call your mom every day, right? But that might be a false expectation. Yeah, yeah.
But I'm also wondering,
Yeah.
Gooden's book on protecting the vulnerable,
Yeah.
which I read many years ago, but I really liked it. But in terms of what you were saying, that, if there's not an expectation, but what I was trying to get at is that, especially for the people that we work with, that their needs make us responsible. Do you know what I mean? That there's that responsibility just doesn't exist from our, our role or our expectations, but that there are vulnerable people to which we are morally obligated to use the skills that we may have or the advantages we may have to be responsible.
Yeah. Yeah, so we might think like different social positionality or access to different resources creates responsibility. Part of what you just said reminds me too of there's a philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who has this idea of like responsibility is ultimately interpersonal, in that responsibility comes from like me seeing the face of someone else and me being responsible for that other person. And so it's like fundamentally between people. It's not like it's I'm responsible or you're responsible, but it's somehow co-created.
So her mother has created a responsibility. A perfect example.
Okay. Yeah. Like
I sort of think of it as part of it as an active type of ownership of experience. So I think it's almost as a flip side of the expectations. So, rather than, I think people can use responsibility as a way of blaming people for not doing things or encouraging people to do things. But I think in terms of certainly in work and in relationships of owning it and being active and I keep coming back to saying being responsible for it, which is really not elaborating very much.
yeah.
But I think that's a more active, engaged process.
Yeah, good. And so part of what you just said helps to pull apart two different ways that philosophers often think about responsibility, which has kind of come up in what people have said, but there's personal responsibility, which is like things you have agency or power over. And then there's like the accountability or the blame or the resentment that like might come if you don't do the things, right? The moral tinge that tends to attach to responsibility. And those technically can come apart. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna go and talk a little bit about different models of thinking about responsibility as it intersects with addiction, and then we'll have a little bit more conversation. So general ways of thinking about responsibility is that responsibility, one, if you're responsible for something, it implies an intentional choice, right? So you're doing something like on purpose. It's not accidental, or you're like, I'm doing this, right? That makes you responsible. It implies that you could do otherwise, right? So if you're kind of forced to do something or you have no choice, it feels weird to say that you're responsible for it. Then we kind of get in, right? So those are like the personal agency parts. And then we get into the moral agency parts, which is accountability, right? So if you're responsible for something, right? So if you're that clinician and you don't do the thing that you're obligated to do or you're responsible for, you can be held accountable for not doing it. And then a bunch of people use the language of feelings. So there's this philosopher, P.S. Strawson, who has this very famous paper called Freedom and Resentment, where he proposes that we have what are called reactive attitudes to other people, which basically means that reactive attitudes are these feelings we have when people do things or don't do things that signal that there's a moral component to what that person is doing. So he says when we feel like blame or resentment to someone for not doing something they were responsible for doing, that's a signal to us that that's a moral kind of failing on the part of that person. And so we wouldn't like if your TV fails, right? You like wouldn't resent it. That would be very weird because like your TV is not like choosing to turn on or off. Right, yeah. Like if it's a Roomba, you might like anthropomorphize it and then.
Right.
Okay, but there's lots, I mean, all of the ways people talked about responsibility were also like very valid. There's a lot of philosophical discussion about what responsibility is and different ways of thinking about it, yeah.
But it feels also like a constrained choice, right? So like people could do otherwise. But there's this notion that you actually don't have a choice, and that's what makes it feel like a responsibility. It's like I don't have a choice. This is what I am supposed to do.
Yeah. So it's that should of like this is the only option, right? And technically, I mean,
The only
this is-
acceptable option or value.
Yeah. And what's interesting with that too is I think a lot of people would think that is fundamentally a restriction of autonomy, right? So if you feel like there's only one viable option for you, right, like only one thing that's moral, then you don't actually have a menu of options. There aren't actually a suite of things that you're able to choose between. And so if people feel constrained, that's also going to be a problem, right? Which is part of a lot of like our social institutions are going to constrain people into thinking there's one should that they have available to them. Okay. So I'm now going to get into some different models of addiction. So I'm going to talk about the moral model of addiction, the disease model of addiction, the brain model of addiction, but there's a whole bunch. But I kind of want us to understand the ways that responsibility kind of intersects with kind of a variety of lifestyle choices that have moral tinges to them. So the moral model of addiction is kind of the one that we operated with for a very long time. It's the one that a lot of people are now like, this makes no sense. But it basically views substance use as a choice, right? It's something people are doing intentionally. They're like, I'm intentionally choosing to have this feeling over do this thing that I'm responsible for. So one, right, there's that personal agency over it. But there's also moral responsibility for it. So it views this choice as bad, right? So that's a choice you shouldn't make, which, right, is something a lot of people are also trying to change now. Like it's not, well, like what is actually bad about it? So the choice is bad. The people who make the choice are bad people. The other people have, I feel like people have a lot of associations with the moral model. So like what other, like, assuming all negative. Like when you think like the moral model of addiction, like what comes up for you? We've talked about stigma a lot already, but.
The moral model was always, at least when it was sort of contrasted with the disease model, was always about blaming the person. But I think I think over time, the problem with moving so far away is that you take away the agency of someone to make a choice.
Yes, we'll get to that.
Okay.
The Nancy Reagan just say no, I
Yeah.
think is really, kind of an example of that.
Yeah,
But also,
With the egg, was it the egg in the pan?
Oh,
Yeah.
That was the,
right.
for a drug-free.
Brain
Oh,
on-
oh,
brain on
oh,
drugs.
oh, this your brain on drugs, yeah, that
Yeah.
was.
But
yeah.
also, like, the 12-step model is,
Yeah.
I'm a morally corrupt or
Really?
inadequate person.
Yeah.
I have, my moral character is
God will save
problematic,
me.
yeah. So, I mean, that's based on this model for sure, it's like you have to admit that you have a moral failing.
Yeah, and so it's somehow, it's connecting like the agency with the moral responsibility to kind of, right, like the just say no is like arguably just the agency, but then the moral responsibility is like, say no, because otherwise you're gonna be a bad person, or because you already are a bad person, or, yeah.
I even think about what John said earlier, like, shouldn't the moral responsibility be on the society that perpetuates drug use?
Yeah, so kind of like flipping, and I've already, I mean, I had a feeling that a lot of you would see that already, right? That it's not individual, but there are a lot of like social things that are kind of pushing people to only have these particular, or to feel like they only have these particular choices. Yeah.
Also like a sense of like that it's unnatural, that it goes against nature to engage in substance use.
Yeah, totally. And this is the thing about like, right, the choice being bad, and you think about, why am I totally blanking on the guy who has the book about the psychopharmaceutical, like,
Michael Pollan.
How to Change Your Mind? Yeah, right, Michael Pollan. Yeah, so I think like people are starting to be like, well, like this isn't necessarily, like what's bad about it?
But also what's unnatural about it, because like literally what it does is it
Right.
takes advantage of your body's natural functions.
Exactly. And then we have very different attitudes about like a variety of different substances, like alcohol versus things that we've decided to legal.
In general, anything that brings us pleasure from our Puritan background, we
Oh, totally. Yeah.
want
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
obligation of pleasure, right? Yeah, no.
Or like pleasure that leads people to, I don't know, like not fulfill certain social roles we think they ought to fulfill, right? Like,
Form.
yeah. Good. Cool. Okay. So problems with the moral model, right? Like a lot of these, a lot of the things you have all said are completely true. Like they are problems with the moral model. A lot of neuroscientists have pushed back on the moral model for kind of right scientific psychological reasons, basically saying that what we're seeing when people are using psychoactive substances is the brain is actually changing, right? So people are having this flood of dopamine, your brain is getting used to it, and then you need more and more of that experience in order to feel any pleasure at all. So you're becoming habituated. You come to associate, right, pleasure, that flood of dopamine, which is like so much more powerful than anything you experience in the rest of your life, as like that is the only way to experience pleasure. And so it's the idea that it's a choice is in some ways it's not a forced choice, but it's definitely kind of compelled by a brain that has fundamentally changed in their response to a substance. Right, so the brain adapts, people become less sensitive to dopamine, they need more. And there are a number of factors, right, that environmental neuroscience, looking at genetic factors, are pointing out that people are susceptible to addiction because of a variety of experiences in their childhood and their family, genetic things that are giving them predispositions to metabolize substances in different ways. So, right, a lot of the push away from the moral model has been on this side of neuroscientists saying like, hey, wait, this is the brain is changing. This is an issue of neuroplasticity. It's not something where it's just like, just say no or just make a different choice.
Can I ask
So-
a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm intrigued by this idea of, the dopamine response, and, here we all are getting dopamine hits left and right from our phones, and kids especially, and the new Surgeon General's, idea that, social media and is really harmful to kids because it's addictive.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any impact from, this is not a substance. It creates a substance in our brain, but it's not something we put in to alter that. with this, or maybe any of the models you're dealing with, like, we're not necessarily talking about substance use, but we are talking about the same dopamine rush we get with our phones. Is
Yeah.
there?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think
Yes.
yeah.
Gaming.
Yeah, like the brain-based model is going to say that addiction is not about, it's not about particular substances. You can be addicted to anything that gives you massive dopamine flood that you then come to associate as like, this is the best thing. And then you like want more and more of it. My phones are ridiculous. My favorite like fact about is the fact that you pull down in order to like refresh email or something like that was intentionally designed to be like slot machines. And so it's that expectation roar of you're like, I think I'm gonna get something good, and then you get an email, and then you're like, I got an email, and so when you're like pulling down to refresh your email, it's because you're expecting the dopamine hit of a new email. So turn off that feature if you can. But yeah, it's exactly the same.
Well, and also just this idea that, I mean, it's a little off topic, but that everything that social media does is engineered to make us do it more, just like smoking. I mean, if you look at like the science behind cigarettes and the nicotine delivery system, it's one of the most studied, like how to get the most nicotine out of the
successful.
paper and out of the filter and out of every leaf of tobacco is one of the most scientifically studied things. And I can't imagine it's not exactly the same with this whole social media stuff.
Totally. That's where the money is. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so there are lots of problems with the moral model, right? Like brain-based, other-based, and that's led a lot of people to favor the disease model. And I'll kind of be interested to hear among people here, like who sort of maybe favors the disease model of addiction. So part of the disease model is saying that substance use, right, is chronic relapsing neurobiological disease, right? So it is fundamentally changing your brain in a pathological way, and it's leading to compulsive use despite negative consequences. And she's actually really nice at saying that the negative consequence piece is really important to identifying it as pathological. Like if you were kind of like able to compulsively use something and there were positive reinforcement mechanism. I mean, I think like
We're all drinking coffee.
I was just gonna say coffee is like the best example, right? It like makes you more functioning in a society that rewards that, and then you do. I mean, like
Or even helping other people, right? It gives
Yeah,
you
yeah.
dopamine surge, so you help more
Yeah.
people, It's just,
Exercise.
exercise, yeah. So it's like fundamentally context dependent, right? It's like the thing that your society is going to reward you for doing. Right. So just as the same way, like your phones can be the thing, it can be like a lot of other things too. So part of the things that come from the disease model are these ideas that the desire for drugs is irresistible, right? So people can't just say no because they actually can't make a choice, right? It's compelled, it's compulsive. So people have no choice. This means people can't be held responsible because it's something that their brain is kind of pushing them to do. This means we can't blame people, right? So part of why people often push a brain disease model is because they see it as a way of pushing back against blame. So the way that we get away from the social stigma attached to addiction is by supporting this idea that addiction is a brain disease. Okay, what other associations do people have like with the disease model? Am I right that people feel maybe more drawn to this one than the moral model? What are your thoughts? Sam, you're nodding aggressively. Yeah.
I mean, my thought process with this has been if it were not a disease, then people wouldn't have struggles with it.
Mhm.
You know, because if you think of people generally being rational actors and the loss that is usually associated with substance use, I think we all know the story of someone who's been in the throe of a substance use problem and is losing jobs and relationships and in and out of prison and losing all the trappings of not necessarily success, but just stability, and like Maslow's hierarchy is being sacrificed for something. No rational person would do that. And so if you see that kind of irrationality, that to me points towards a neurobiologic pathology.
Mhm.
Now, there that doesn't mean that there is not a element of choice, because we often say treatment will work when you're ready for it to work. And so if you put someone in treatment and they don't want it, it's probably not gonna do much. And so I think that's the interesting distinction that comes up.
Yeah, and so there's this association between irrationality and maybe like not having a choice, right? Irrationality and some kind of compulsion because people are ostensibly rational, right? But then there's this idea that in order to recover, right, in order for treatment to be effective, there does have to be some kind of like what philosophers call reasons responsiveness, right? So like responsiveness to reasons to use or not to use, like to negative consequences.
So I definitely lean more towards this than I do to the moral model, but there are still, I think to me, two places where the road that really need to get hammered out. One of them is despite negative consequences, and so negative consequences is defined by whom. So that becomes tough, because then we're still like, what is the should that we're mutually agreeing upon? And then the second part of this is if we totally surrender the agency of the person in the disease model, then it seems to me that the obvious kind of next step is that we use some sort of substituted judgment for them. Then that allows us the opportunity to like take their autonomy away and decide for them, which seems problematic.
Yeah, good. So this is like, I do a lot of research on autonomy and I love thinking about autonomy, right? But like, this is basically saying like, if you're not responsible, if you don't have a choice, maybe because of your capacity, right? Because you're like fundamentally irrational or whatever, yeah, then paternalism is totally fine. Like paternalism is fine with people who are non-autonomous. So then you can make decisions for them that is for their good. And that something feels icky about that or wrong. Yeah, Brenda.
So one of the other things, like in kind of this area, is we're lumping lots of use together. We're lumping prevention or early use, moderate use to very severe use. And so, kind of in thinking about that, like, before one tries a drug, you think that you have an option, you could have taken it or not. And I think that is where some people get hung up on the moral part. But also there's this, one of the problems or situations with the disease model and the brain model is working especially with adolescents who then are like, wait a minute, so since I'm in treatment, I'm in recovery, does that mean I'm always diseased? Does that mean my brain is completely altered and can never go back? And so, but I also see the importance of making it a disease brain drug because now we can make medication, we can make treatment, we can charge, insurance on it versus it just being it's all you. So there's a lot, I think, going on, and it depends on what angle you're gonna address this from, what model you wanna kind of favor.
Yeah, good. So you're doing the thing that philosophers are very bad at, which is you're inviting nuance, right? So like philosophers like to be like, addiction, this is what it is, this is our model. But you're totally right? It really depends. If you're talking about like a phone versus alcohol versus opioids, like those are all very different situations. But yeah, also, and we'll get at this a little bit later, this idea that you have no agency can be, it can feel like you're completely determined, right? And like that can really end up.
And as a society, when you take away agency, we dehumanize. It ends poorly for us.
Right. If we think the agency, which most philosophers, I think most people do, is like one of the key factors of what it is to be a human being, right? Like you can act rationally, then yeah, taking that away is saying you're compelled. Philosophers would say you're acting on like instinct and in response to situations. That's what animals do, right? Like that's not what people do. Yeah. Lisa, John, and Lloyd.
Just quickly on that, this reminds me of the early days of HIV where, the disease model is what's coming from the majority gaze. Like if you put a bunch of people who want to make people better, healthcare providers, whatever, and what they, that tool they have with a hammer, they're gonna see you as a nail. I think this is really something that brought this to the Addiction Medicine Society. This is all about like what can we do to treat you and what can we give you to treat your problem. So it's a little bit of a hammer in search of a nail. It reminds me of HIV in the beginning because for the first 25 years of HIV prevention at CDC, our director had to be a physician. yet we were doing no medical interventions. We were doing behavioral interventions entirely. And we couldn't have a behavioral scientist be the leader of that group. It had to be a physician because we were in search of some substance to make this better. And so I worry a little bit about this, but who's putting this forward? It's really the people who think that this is gonna be the answer. If we have something to treat you, then we're treating your disease. So I just want us to think a little bit about that majority gaze again, like the perspective of the people who think they can fix something. They're gonna problematize it in, with respect to how their fix will.
Yeah, good, and I think this brings up the paternalism point again in that, so, there are a lot of, again, this is like one of my areas of interest, but there are a lot of feminist theorists who are very worried about concepts of autonomy that makes autonomy dependent on like circumstances, right? So, if people who are marginalized are more likely to use substances and that takes away their autonomy, that means that the dominant, right, or the privileged can just make decisions for them, right, for their good, and it basically preserves social hierarchy in a really problematic way. Yeah, so definitely something to ward against.
Yeah, I was gonna say it feels like overly essentialist and like sexual orientation, right? Like we went from a moral model of sexual orientation to the opposite extreme and said it's fully genetic. Nobody has a choice.
Yeah.
You would never choose that. Like, so it just feels exactly the same, and it feels like applying medicine to a social problem because medicine feels objective and people in society couldn't possibly disagree if it was determined by medicine. But then that seems to have eroded public trust in medicine and science now, right? Like
Right.
everything is questioned. Like so many people now think like their physicians know nothing about them or what they need and don't go to doctors anymore. So like I just feel like it was the sense that like, oh, well, medicine is our one objective thing, so we're gonna frame it in terms of a medical model because we don't like the model where blame is placed on people.
Right.
But it was like taking it too far to the other extreme, and we need to acknowledge that it's a social and a structural issue and that those two things play into it. It's not all just medical.
Yeah, so it's like this desire, again, like the paternalism is always well-intentioned, right? It like comes out of like wanting to benefit other people. It's like let's like generate compassion by identifying this group of people as like fundamentally non-autonomous, irrational, unable to make a choice, whatever, yeah.
I think what's striking to me about this is, and I think this is unique to substance use, so there's probably one other area where this happens as well, which is that we hold the disease and the moral model as if it can only be one or the other. And I'm pretty sure for 100% of other diseases, we incorporate a moral component as well. So people have a disease, but they interact with their disease. So people who have diabetes still eat sugar, and we look at both of those things. But somehow with substance use, it's like it's either a disease, in which case they have no control, or it's their fault, in which case it doesn't matter, they have all control.
Right,
And it's the only place I can think, maybe sexual orientation, that like that's an interesting, it's not a disease, but it's an interesting, where we only have those.
To some people.
I mean, we only have those two like
Yeah.
ways of looking at it, but those,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
course, it doesn't work.
Right, like there has to be more nuance, yeah.
Or some nuance, I mean,
Yeah.
I think, Loy, like the whole, every chronic disease is kind of the same thing, like diabetes, obesity, I mean, Ozempic has completely changed the way that people are thinking about obesity, and they have no clue how to deal with that because it was all blame game. And now it's like, oh, wait a minute, it's something in the food, it's something in the body chemistry. I mean, that's just, I think that is kind of how we deal with chronic diseases. I think it's both. I think for most chronic diseases, the moral and/or.
right, and it only seems like for substance use that we're at least partly saying it's one or the other. And of course, there's these biological features that we uncover and they interact with moral, you know.
I'm remembering, I don't remember who the author was, but there was this very controversial paper, like only a philosopher would say this. But it was something that was saying that we should like stigmatize people eating like fatty food the same way that we stigmatize cigarette smoking. And so it was basically saying like if we really want to like counter obesity, like this is the best, anyway, yeah. So, they all, yeah.
Yeah,
Isn't that what we tried
smoking
to
was
do in New
literally
York?
our society condones
And with HIV.
major
with HIV.
stigmatization of people who smoke,
Yeah.
laws against stigmatize, I mean, it succeeded with smoking.
You remember, it's never just HIV?
Yeah, yeah.
We also don't acknowledge that the vast majority of substance users use substances responsibly.
Yeah.
Right, like I mean, including the vast majority, I think, of opioid users use opioids responsibly. It's not, we sort of narrow in on this as a problem and then it's everything.
Right,
And that there are positive consequences and not just negative consequences. And sometimes the positive consequences outweigh the negative consequences, even if they're more
Especially marijuana.
feelings-based than
yeah,
logic-based.
yeah.
I think that also points to one of the limitations of diagnosis, because a lot of our criterion to give someone a use disorder is based on the amount of social loss that they've had due to the substance. And that is predicated on having something to lose in the first place. And it's also predicated on the amount of extra resource that you have to compensate. So if you are someone who is well off and working from home and drinking but still getting your work done, like I run into this a lot with like young professionals who ostensibly are probably drinking more than is healthy, but they don't meet criteria for a use disorder. So it's hard to, because they haven't met all three of the things I need to check off. And so it's hard to then say, well, do you have a use disorder? Because we have to, give it a label. But it doesn't mean that they don't want treatment or assistance with cutting down or stopping.
Yeah, it's that idea that pathology has to attach to negative consequences, and for people who are maybe like socially buffered against negative consequences, it's gonna be very difficult to see as pathological, yeah. Okay,
And also, I mean, it also relies on the substance being viewed as bad, right? Like,
right,
we're on tons of substances
Yeah.
all the time
Yeah.
that are created by pharmaceutical companies that nobody ever thinks of calling that a substance use disorder. Someone's on an antidepressant for their entire lives. No one says, you're addicted to antidepressants.
it's very, I've noticed in academics, like, so people, right, are very addicted to coffee, clearly. But I know a lot of academics who have a lot of trouble sleeping, and people are like, well, I don't wanna take like a sleeping pill because I don't wanna take something unnatural and I don't wanna become dependent on it. It's like, well, you're dependent on like a lot, but yeah, so we have these like weird social like intuitions about different things.
And their coffee use is probably causing their sleep problem, right? So it's a negative consequence.
Right, or like the dopamine hit from like. Okay, so, wait, let me just see, okay. Yes, so for a lot of the reasons that you've also identified, like the disease model is seen as too simplistic, right? It's kind of like taking away people's agency, it's like well-intentioned, right, in wanting to remove blame, but there seem to be issues with it, even though it has been for a while like the best alternative to the moral model. So, right, some of the things that Picard picks out for like why the disease model is problematic is, one, it's like not true that people have no choice or that they're compelled. So there's the fact that people mature out of addiction, right, as they get older. That tends to be something that is like less compelling. There's lots of evidence that the choice to use certain substances is cost sensitive. So depending on kind of financial incentives and disincentives or criminal incentives and disincentives, right, people will make choices to use or not to use. She talks about this interesting study in rats where rats would choose like sugar or like snuggling. Which is cute. There was a great Twitter account for a while that was called In Mice that basically just tweeted out titles of scientific studies that the news had picked up and added mice in parentheses because they were all, so that's in rats is. But there's also, right, this idea that, which a bunch of you have said, that the sense of agency or empowerment or self-understanding is seen as essential to recovery. And so when we favor the disease model, we tend to get rid of that option. I wanted to add that, so you didn't read Stephen Morse. Stephen Morse is a law professor and philosopher at University of Pennsylvania who's been like a very vocal critic of the disease model and the way that it interacts with criminal law. And so he just has this very interesting argument against the disease model, which is basically that people do have a lot of like rational and control capacities, even, and these are quotes, right? So this is a lot of the language he's using. But he cites this court case where essentially the defense is saying that someone was compelled, so they were not responsible for the crimes they committed in order to use the substance that they were using. And the part of the questioning is like, well, how did you get here today? And he's like, well, I knew I had to be here. And it's like, are you using something now? And he's like, no, because like I knew I had to be. So it's basically saying like, well, you're not compelled because when you know you have to be somewhere, you can do it. And so Morris wants to argue that, right, even action that's part of a disease state can be evaluated morally. The law, right, is fundamentally concerned with this idea that individuals are people who act for reasons. He has a bit of a slippery slope argument where he says, essentially, if we want to allow that people who are addicted to substances are not responsible, we have to like do away with responsibility altogether, because kind of all of us are pushed into certain actions by our circumstance, right? Like we're all determined to a certain extent. So if we allow that people who are addicted are determined, then all of us are determined, and then we can't hold anyone responsible for anything, which is a very philosophical argument. But the part of what I wanted to highlight is that he has this interesting contrast between seeing the disease model, which sees drug use as inevitable, sees it as a natural mechanism, right? So your brain is kind of like determining you or forcing you into doing something. He compares it with someone who is holding onto a cliff, right? And gravity is pulling them down. And he says, if you had someone who was pointing a gun at the person and said, I will shoot you if you fall, like the person you don't have a choice, right? You're holding onto the cliff. Gravity is going to pull you down whether you like want it to happen or not. That's a natural mechanism. That is something like you have no control over. If someone is placed in front of their substance of choice and someone says, I'm going to shoot you if you use this, most people will not use it. And so he uses that as a way to say this is clearly not a natural mechanism. This is something that people actually do have agency over.
Isn't the proper analogy though if you let go, not if you fall?
Maybe, yeah.
No, I'm saying if you're gonna make that argument, then if a person falls, that's by definition out of their control, right?
Right, yeah, sorry, if you, yeah.
Right. Now, they may inevitably
Or if you
let
stop,
go.
something like if you stop holding on or.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, the other distinction that people draw, which is helpful, is between a brain model and a disease model. And so a number of neuroscientists want to retain this idea that addiction is fundamentally a neurobiological process, right? So Lisa, the same way you were talking about like the phone and stuff, you want to say like, yes, it's this dopamine pathway response where you're getting too much dopamine and then your brain is changing, but we don't have to pathologize it, right? So we don't have to say that that's a disease, and we can say it's just like this is a different brain. Why do we attach the moral or the kind of clinical medical idea to it? And so they say there are pros and cons to the brain disease model. And again, I didn't give you guys this article, but if people want it, I can send it. As a lot of people have said, the pros of the brain disease model are it allows people access to treatment and social services and health insurance reimbursement. So we have a lot of like social reasons why we might want to use the brain disease model. But then they say cons are we then are identifying someone as diseased, right? So fundamentally abnormal, pathological. And so that's actually contributing to stigma. It's saying you are someone with a substance use disorder. You're abnormal, you're unwell. And so that is something that they argue we ought to push against when we consider use of the brain disease model. Okay. So then I had you read the Picard because I think Picard has a really nice middle path between these extremes of the moral model and the disease model, both of which, for a variety of reasons, are unsatisfactory. And essentially what she wants to do is she wants to pull apart this idea of personal agency from this idea of moral responsibility and say, let's separate choice from blame. Let's acknowledge that Morse, right, is right in a lot of ways. People still have choice over certain things. And I'll clarify too, I forgot to say this about Morse. One of the things Morse highlights is that people have a variety of control over different actions. So he wants to say people are more likely to be culpable for actions that are divorced from use of a substance. So you're less responsible for things like using, possessing, and buying an illegal substance, because those are the things that are most likely to be compelled, right? They're the actions and the habits that are closely identified with drug use. Other things, right, like maybe the lifestyle choices and kind of the things you need to do in order to support your addiction, those are things that you actually have a lot more choice over because they're not directly connected to that neurobiological process. So Picard, right, kind of has a way of getting us through that. So we're engaging with patients as, or in your work, right, participants in your research as responsible agents who have the power to change, but we're disattaching like the blame and the moral approbation from that. So it's this interesting middle path. She says, well, don't we still need to like hold somewhat, like, don't we need to have some conception of responsibility, right? So who is responsible for the fact that addiction exists in our society? And she points out, like, substances are offering a way of coping with a number of social disadvantages, right? So socioeconomic inequality, limited opportunities, inadequate resources for mental health, prejudice and stigma. And so all of these things are things that socially are problems that are going to make a substance look at like a nice way to experience some pleasure in the midst of difficulty. So she says society is ultimately responsible for changing these things, not individuals. So again, even though it's allowing that individuals have agency over their choices, right, and over kind of treatment and getting better, it's also saying that society, all of us, have responsibility too. So again, it's a nice way of having it both ways. And I'll just add, this is connected to my own research on relational autonomy, which, right, autonomy is like so central to research ethics. Essentially what relational autonomy wants to say is that our ability to kind of make decisions, to understand things that are open to us, are a product both of socialization, right, so how we've developed within societies, but also of our immediate context. And so it's basically saying, like, if you are socialized in a context where like women are seen as fundamentally like too emotional to make certain types of decisions, you might come to believe that about yourself. Like that's part of your socialization. And then you might also find yourself in social contexts where people don't treat you as if you're an authoritative decision maker. And that is also going to affect your ability to make decisions. And so what I like about relational autonomy, again, is that it means not just like letting people choose, not just saying like, this is your choice, and like, but it thinks about the social context of how do we develop those capacities, and then how do we support and enable them, which I think is something that is aligned with Picard.
Like Childress said, and I always like the statement, you know, that autonomy need not be in isolation, right? That autonomy can be relational, that
Yes.
people can help you, and you still have autonomy because it's not singular.
Yeah, totally. Okay,